Sifu is out on PlayStation consoles and PC, and it is getting very positive reviews, as well as a lot of discussion about its mechanics and styling, both good and bad. But here today, I'm joined by Digital Foundry's Audi Sorlie to talk about exotic salamis. No, wait! We're here to talk about Hong Kong action film, as well as the PC and PlayStation 5 version, and the technical characteristics thereof. Audi, how are you doing?
I'm doing quite well. Both my salamis and me are ready for this talk. My other love, of course, is Hong Kong action. And I've actually done quite a number of DVD commentaries for Blu-rays.
Yes,
and
you have.
DVDs, obviously, for Hong Kong action over the years. And so this was a game I had an eye on for quite some time.
But before we get into the technical aspects here, I think it's pretty good to introduce the audience to exactly what kind of a game this is, and there's really no better person here at Digital Foundry than you, Audi. So, Audi, if you were to describe this game in very simple terms, how would you first describe it to someone who's never played a game like this before?
I mean, in essence, it is a simple brawler. It's a two-button brawler. You have two attacks, and then you dodge and wave a lot. So, in a way, it feels almost like a boxing game, you know, from EA and such, when you have like a lot of control over your dodge, and that's something that really plays into the game. But at the heart of it, it's a game about family.
Yeah,
that's what it is. It's a game about family.
Is this?
And we won't be stealing too many Red Letter Media jokes here, but
I was gonna say. Okay, so yeah, a very simplistic game in terms of its execution of the little things, but there's a lot of nuance in there as well too that you can probably talk about. Part of this, I think as well, comes from the styling of the game. It is made by French studio Slow Clap,
yes.
But it seems to take place in Anywheresville, China. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so it's not necessarily Hong Kong, having researched a lot of locations and such. I'm not really sure where this is kind of taking place, as has been kind of made clear from some other very good articles. The actual written Chinese is also somewhat confusing in the English language version, though I did learn this morning from my Chinese friend apparently the Chinese translation is more accurate, so I guess the localization team have done some fixes there. But as you and I are not Chinese, it's not really for me to sit there and talk about too much how accurate that is. Yeah, at the heart of it is a brawler that takes you through various settings that are very familiar to action film fans, specifically in Hong Kong action, and get waves of enemies, take down those enemies in a very stylistic fashion, and I'm sure we can talk about the gameplay mechanics a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So the one thing I noticed right away is that, I mean, I've played a lot of Souls games, I'm used to parrying mechanics, and I was maybe being a bit overly reliant on it here, because you kind of get into a fight, you're surrounded by enemies, you can really only engage with one at a time. I don't think I found any multiple engagement moves.
This is what's kind of interesting here, because as a brawler, your crowd control is everything. You play something like Final Fight stuff, you kind of have to read patterns, right? In this game, combine different strikes. You have a light strike and a heavy strike. Also have a experience system, which you can then upgrade your moveset with combos and focus attacks. The focus attacks require you to upgrade your bar on the bottom there. You can see the blue bar, and then you unleash some focus attacks, which basically will stun your enemies, deal some damage. You go into these waves of enemies and they will surround you. It's hard to kind of say what has happened here, but generally the attacks and essence of motion in the game is very focused, and I had trouble getting the crowd control part down, that's for sure. And it seems like the game kind of wants you to become a Sifu,
yeah.
But in the sense that your character and its animation, just the animation alone seems very focused and tunneled towards an enemy, not multiple. It didn't really leave me too satisfied how I could keep the crowd under control there.
I was struggling at mainly at those parts. I was pretty good at the one-on-one combat with bosses and whatnot, but as soon as I was surrounded by multiple characters, I was having a little bit of a hard time both traversing the environment and dealing with the camera, oddly enough. You do have light control over the camera in combat, but but it doesn't seem to always move where you want it to.
It's kind of funny because the game is almost shot like a Hong Kong movie, kind of off the cuff and loose. So the camera is interesting because in some specific types, the camera is very close, right? The camera is quite dynamic. I honestly think that if the game had like more of a isometric option and a cinematic option, maybe it would be a bit easier, but it should also be noted that you have like this section here in the first level where it's like Old Boy, another reference, where you see it from the side like a classic brawler. It's quite interesting, but it leaves somewhat a lot to be desired, because the biggest issue I have with the game is just from a design's perspective. The audio design is quite reduced, and the game leaves very little in the way of telegraphing what's coming towards you. I've seen a lot of reviews mentioning the difficulty, and it is very difficult. And I think part of it is just I'm having a lot of trouble from both visually reading the animations, who is attacking me, how are they attacking, and how am I supposed to dodge. Because the actual window, the trigger windows for your parry and your dodges are very minimal. On top of it, you have very... it's strange because in the Hong Kong action we'll have very like distinct sound design, right? Hard punches and very like swooshy. But in this game, a lot of the sound effects I find very subdued and muffled.
I'm going to show off a little clip here to describe that a little bit in the club scene here, where this is the default mix. And you can kind of hear how you don't hear a lot of the punches and blocks as much, but more the ambient sounds and some very light, you know, like punch noises.
Yeah, and also the visual identifier of what's actually coming towards you. It is almost like the game is expecting you to, like, you know how to fight in the game and in real life. Be prepared, man. It is a game that throws you into its world, you know, like a Souls game. I don't like using the term Souls-like, and in this case, there are aspects that are sort of like that. You have that interesting death mechanic. Basically, how many times you die and such, your character will grow older, which comes with its trade-offs and perks. Like, you get stronger, but you have lower health and stamina. I find to unbalance the game somewhat fast. So it is
rather rapidly.
Yeah, rather rapidly. You're just kind of like, well, that changes everything. It's very much realistic, because that's how my 30s were. I entered my 30s, and I was stronger, but I have no more stamina.
I think one last thing I want to talk about before we move on to the technicals here is, you mentioned Old Boy. What were some other cinematic callouts that you thought were rather obvious when playing?
Oh man, but I mean, the entire game is a cinematic callout. You know, Old Boy, that sequence is very famous to modern action fans. Obviously, the first stage has that climb up the apartments, like the raid. There's a lot of things that people would probably not recognize just from, you know, it's not location based, but it's behavioral based. So a lot of the actual martial arts is very Wing Chun based, which is the original style that Bruce Lee used, which he eventually, you know, we go on to do Jeet Kune Do, and then they actually use a lot of that as well. There is no one martial arts style in the game. This goes into very technical martial arts things, and I think most people would tune out, so I will keep it short. A lot of people have done wrong by comparing this to Batman, where you have a very free flow way. I always call it the Stretch Armstrong battles, because Batman just like stretches all over the place and jumps from place to place. That's not how the game works, and the animation actually reflects this, because the main character, well, let's just call him Ryu Hazuki. His animation actually has small transition points. It seems like the game has some slight animation system to string together techniques by transitional animation. Quite interesting if you are familiar with martial arts. The game actually does make a lot of references to real martial arts, obviously. This is very cool. But then if you play the game from the obvious things, like the bosses have a lot to do with Wheels on Meals, is specifically a movie I see a lot of references from, both in their attack patterns and stuff. But what was most interesting to me, and I was kind of surprised that they did this, is that you mentioned the opening tutorial to me before recording, which is like basically Shenmue retold. But after that, you have this red scene you can see here. this is quite interesting because specifically for Asian markets, for Hong Kong action, they had a sequence called Against the Red, which was before the movie would start. The main actors in the film would do demonstrations of the martial arts styles they would use in the film. So it's basically to prepare the audience for what kind of fighting, what kind of styles. So if it was Honga, if it was, you know, these kinds of styles that would be in there, they would show that off Against the Red.
That's cool.
So for this game, it seems they settled on a style called Pak Mei, which is actually a Wing Chun hybrid style. And that was done in collaboration with a real-life master who's called Benjamin Colossi down there in France. It's quite cool just to see. In the wake of like people saying that perhaps they didn't do as much research for culturally correct things in the game, which definitely there is a case to be made for that. For a cinematic culture standpoint, they've actually taken the time to look into the history of Hong Kong action and gotten some of these more obscure things into the game.
This plays into our next discussion point, which is actually how they're doing this all together. Because when you've been watching this game playing out in front of us right now, as Audi's been talking, the game definitely has a very specific style to it. It is using Unreal Engine 4.
Yeah.
And you wouldn't necessarily guess that right off the bat due to a lot of the decisions they've made in the game here.
It doesn't look like one, right? I wasn't sure what this was until I asked you, and until I got stutter. Spoiler alert.
Yeah, spoilers.
But it's very clean. Textures are very clean. It's almost like flat shaded in some cases. And actually, I was noting to you, if you look at the character model, especially the main character model up close, it has very like sharp polygonal structures, right? And if you look closely, it kind of feels like they've modeled this after like a Virtua Fighter look. The character renders are quite interesting in this game, and the personalities really come out.
Part of this comes in, like you said, like very little actual texturing. It's mainly like plain colors for a lot of things. A lot of just dull materials as well too. Not a lot of stuff is very shiny, which is, you know, kind of against the grain for a lot of Unreal Engine games. There's like, if you look at the shot here, there's only like one object, and it's like the trash bags that are shiny, even though they're in direct sunlight. Another thing, this game apparently targeted originally PlayStation 4, and they're at 1080p at 60 FPS. There are some technical aspects of that play into the rest of the visuals as a result. To keep the load down, the game doesn't actually use any like heavily expensive effects like screen space reflections. Instead, there's some levels like you can see here in the club level that use planar reflections on the ground, which means they double the geometry, which is usually pretty expensive. But to keep the cost down elsewhere, they do a lot of other things. Like, for example, there's barely any usage of SSAO in here that's really obvious. A lot of it's just like heavily baked lighting, not a lot of real-time lighting. But, you know, other than that, there were some other little touches that I really liked here. One, I really liked the usage of per-object motion blur in the game. You know, it does make the game look super cinematic, which I think is very purposeful. And another thing that, this is just a cute little thing, but there's two things. So look at this fan right here, and look at how they're like trying to do, like they try and make it kind of look comic book-esque in moments, like the fan here, the motion blur on it. It's like, it's just a texture. It's very fake, but it looks very nice. And as well as the glasses on any of the characters. So usually in a game, you would want to have glasses pick up lighting using some real-time lighting system, etc. But here, it's literally just like a scrolling texture, like something you would see on like a PS1 or PS2 game that looks like light is hitting it. So it's very old school, and that comes across in the graphics as well too.
So yeah, as I mentioned, I mostly play this on PS5, you PC, and I'm kind of curious then, Alex, how the experience was for you on PC.
Yeah, so I played PS5 and PC here, and the main differences you'll notice are in resolution. PlayStation 5 is running at 4K native. It may have dynamic resolution scaling, but I didn't really see it happening in any meaningful way. On PC, it's obviously variable resolution. It depends on what your setup is. Here, the footage you've been watching in the background has, funnily enough, been running at 8K.
8K?
So another thing that PlayStation 5 version has that is not on PC is all the DualSense features.
Yeah.
It's like you get, the rain pitter-patter on the controller, which is very typical DualSense implementation, as well as a not too awesome sounding sound through the DualSense
Yeah,
controller.
this was a huge turn off for me because, for example, in the beginning, it rains. And it seems like the game, the DualSense settings, it can't really measure much in ways of distance. So you will like enter a building and the sound will just get muffled, but there, it doesn't measure distance. So if you stand close to a window or something, it's still just muffled. As soon as you go out the door, it's super loud.
Yeah.
It's not implemented too well, so I don't know if you don't have it. I wouldn't say you're missing out on much.
No, you're really not. And on PC, I tried plugging a DualSense there, but I just got PS4 prompts. It worked, but without any of the DualSense features. Some other differences you'll see, like I mentioned earlier, you can see, like I said, differences in the versions based upon your resolution. Like here, there's differences between obviously running the game at 8K and the native 4K of PlayStation 5, but these aren't very big differences. Another difference, of course, too, is that the PlayStation 5 seems to be using very customized settings. The most obvious differences in the custom settings that I are using are like in shadow map resolution, where you can, for example, see here that it's not high, it's not ultra, it's also not like cinematic quality. It's something in between like high and ultra, and you really won't notice a big difference there other than like shadow aliasing on some scenes, like on this character face here. And other than that, I noticed that the shadow map cascade on PlayStation 5 cuts off into the distance in a way that I couldn't match at all on any PC setting. So like here, there's like ultra on the one hand and low on the other side, and PlayStation 5 for some reason is like lower than all of those. It uses some custom settings that I imagine are partially inherited from the PlayStation 4 version. It has that little negative, which isn't actually that big of a negative, but has a really great positive on PlayStation 5 of the fact that the game loads really, really quickly. You barely notice it. It flashes the loading screen for a quick second or two, and then you're in game. Here in this test I did of loading the first botanist level, loading that on PlayStation 5, it was like 3, almost 4 seconds, and then on PCs of a variety of speeds of CPUs, and then the exact same speed SSD, running 6 to around 8 seconds. So
8 seconds is just 8 seconds is 4 seconds more than I have, so that's just unacceptable.
Yeah. This is completely unacceptable.
Imagine what I could do. Imagine the number of salamis I could talk about in the next 4 seconds.
Another great thing about the PlayStation 5 version that I encountered here, we've been talking about a lot of, the technical aspects, but in all of this, there's one really great story here, is that the performance in the game, at least in my testing on PlayStation 5, getting up into the club level before dying incessantly and not wanting to restart the game.
You were like 70 years old by then, right?
I was like 70 in the club level, 0 issues for performance on my end.
4K 60, almost all the way through, and I say almost all the way through because I played up until the 3rd level. I almost never encountered any stutter. I did get slight stutter on, of course, the gameplay that I didn't capture, because you were just like, hey, try it out.
Yeah.
But during the botanist, which is the first boss, there is like 2 phases to him. He jumps into the woods, he disappears, and he comes back, and there's a slight like flash effect, or like sparkle effect that happens when he comes back. And I noticed that the game had like a slight hiccup. There is ways to get some stutter, but it's very minimal, and certainly did detract from any actual experience outside.
Yeah, so if you do get it, I could not record that, but if you do get it, there could be reasons why. Going over to PC, we see mostly a very, very smooth experience, but I'll get to the caveat in a second here. So on PC, like if you wanted to play it on an RTX 3090 like I did for some of my play, you can play at 4K native at like above 120 FPS the entire time. It's very
8K 120.
Yeah, you could do it if you wanted it with DLSS. The game supports DLSS, which is very nice to see. So all the footage you've been seeing right now has been done in 8K DLSS balanced mode, which is like internally like 6K, so like stupidly high res. But if you're running on a average Joe PC, I did test this out as well on a Ryzen 5 3600 tag team GTX 1060 versus RX 580, and I found that at 1440p at the ultra settings that the GTX 1060 does quite a bit better. It barely dips below 60 FPS, and on average in all the scenes I recorded using the first level as a litmus test, it was 30% faster, and the RX 580 was dipping below 60 FPS in the cutscenes, but honestly in gameplay it was pretty great. But if you're watching this right now and I'm showing these cutscenes playing side by side, you will notice that there was a stutter there. This game, unfortunately, on PC has some stuttering issues.
Yeah, so tell me more about this, because obviously I did not see this on PS5.
No, this doesn't happen on PS5 at all. I did check it out, though. Apparently this happens on PS4, where essentially on PC, when you go from area to area, you walk into a new area, you open a door, you run into a new area. Any single time something appears to be loading or deloading in the background, you get a stutter. And the length and severity of the stutter will be partially PC dependent. For example, I found GTX 1060 Ryzen 5 3600 that the stutter length was longer than I saw on the RTX 3090 massive Core i9-10900K PC. But, you know, This is really consistent. It happens almost every single time you open a door or do any of these transition moments. It doesn't get in the way of the gameplay, thankfully, but it does definitely take away from like the cinematic aspect of the game flowing.
Yeah.
Because it is, you know, like you're going from one area to the next, and it's like very deft camera movement sometimes when doing it, and it takes away from that, and that is a shame. This is something that we've seen in other Unreal Engine titles in the past.
Yeah, what's up with that?
Not uncommon. I don't know, man. It's something. It happened in Returnal of all games as well, too.
It's been kind of like the bane of your existence, this Unreal stutter issue.
I mean, there's so many reasons for it, but this one, well, immediately as I saw it, I think I posted it on Slack. I was like, oh no.
Yes.
But I've apprised the developers of this issue and could possibly in the future see some action. But that's really about it for the game, technically, artistically, and gameplay-wise. Audi, I would love to hear some concluding comments from you, since you're the expert here.
It is a love letter to Hong Kong action, and having grown up with it, I have a lot of fun with the game, but I'm also quite forgiving of it due to this. And it's a very simple concept, but is, no pun intended, very hard to master. I do think that gameplay-wise, it leaves a little bit to be desired, because the game does focus a lot on multiple enemies, but it doesn't give you much in the way of crowd control. From an audio perspective, it could also be a little bit better. I wish there was more range in the actual sound in terms of both. The music is quite... I mean, the music is good, but I find it just, again, so subdued and shy. I wish the whole game came more out at me in so many ways, and kind of, you know, demonstrated itself and made more of an impact like a Hong Kong action film would. You know, for people who like a good challenge, people who love a good presentation, this is among the finest you'll find, on, especially on PS5 at the moment, because I mean, you get almost flawless 4K 60. It's very pick up and play. There's not much in the way of depth, so like, you know, if you're willing to spend time with it, it's a very good experience for PS5.
Yeah, and I would say the same for PS5. PC is the one area where I think there are currently just a couple of issues. I really think AMD performance should be quite a bit better, even in DX11 here, that these are almost unheard of differences between the GPUs, so not very good. And that stutter issue, I imagine the devs are looking into that right now. But Audi, thank you so much for taking all this time to talk with me about, did you say Sifu?
There is different ways of pronouncing it, and there's been some discussion of how I speak very little Cantonese. I did study Cantonese, believe it or not, back a few years ago, but yeah, it's however you want to say it, my friend. It is okay.
Okay, well, forgive me that, everyone in the audience, but if you did enjoy Audi and I talking about this game, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Hit that little bell in the corner.
Ring the bell.
Patreon.
Pull the strings.
Twitter. And I want to say Auf Wiedersehen und
Ha det bra.